The massive courtroom stretched across 3 city blocks, its crystalline walls reaching toward the artificial sky of Station Nexus. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy filled the viewing galleries, their various forms creating a living tapestry of scales, fur, chitin, and energy fields. At the center of it all sat the Tribunal of Seven, the most powerful judicial body in known space. Ambassador Zephyr of the Aquilian Federation stood in the defendant's dock, her blue-scaled hands bound with energy shackles that pulsed with each heartbeat. The charges against her were severe: conspiracy to incite rebellion, unauthorized contact with primitive species, and violation of the non-interference directive. Each charge carried a sentence of neural reconditioning, effectively erasing everything that made Zephyr who she was. Chief Arbiter Vorak, a massive insectoid being whose mandibles clicked ominously, read the charges with practiced indifference. His compound eyes reflected the cold light of the courtroom as he spoke in the universal trade language. The defendant stands accused of crimes against galactic stability. How does the defendant plead? Not guilty on all counts, Zephyr replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She had known this day would come ever since she decided to help the struggling colonies in the Outer Rim. What she hadn't expected was how quickly the trial would be arranged, or how few witnesses would be allowed to speak on her behalf. Prosecutor Malith, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline shell, rose from his position. His voice resonated through the courtroom like the humming of a massive engine. Honored arbiters, the evidence against the defendant is overwhelming. We have communication logs, surveillance footage, and testimony from reliable sources. Ambassador Zephyr willfully violated the sacred non-interference directive not once, but 17 times over the past standard year. The prosecution's evidence flowed across holographic displays throughout the courtroom. Communication records between Zephyr and colony leaders, footage of her ships delivering supplies to quarantined worlds, and witness statements from various Federation officials. Each piece of evidence was damning, but Zephyr noticed something troubling about the presentation. The context was missing. Every communication shown was edited, cutting off just before or after the crucial parts that would explain her actions. The surveillance footage was carefully chosen to show only her ships arriving at the colonies, never the desperate conditions that had prompted her intervention. The witness statements came from officials who had been pushing for war with the Outer Rim colonies for decades. Defense attorney Crix, an elderly Voltan with silver-tipped tentacles, attempted to object to the presentation. Honored arbiters, this evidence lacks proper context. We request permission to present the full communication records and additional witness testimony. Arbiter Vorak's mandibles clicked once, a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. Objection noted and denied. The prosecution's evidence is sufficient for our review. Zephyr felt her heart sink. She had expected bias, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The trial wasn't just rigged. It was a performance designed to justify a predetermined outcome. The tribunal had already decided her fate before she ever set foot in the courtroom. As the prosecution continued their presentation, Zephyr's mind wandered to the colonies she had tried to help. The Kepler 442 system had been ravaged by a plague that the Federation could have easily cured, but the non-interference directive prevented any aid. Children were dying while Federation ships sat at the system's edge, forbidden to act. The Tau Ceti colonies faced starvation after their crops failed, their desperate pleas for help falling on deaf ears in the Federation Council. She had broken the law. That much was true. But sometimes the law was wrong. The prosecution's case continued for hours, each piece of evidence adding another layer to Zephyr's guilt. Prosecutor Malith painted her as a rogue agent who had abandoned her sworn duties for personal gain. He suggested that her actions could have led to galactic war, that primitive species might have developed dangerous ideas about their place in the universe. The defendant's actions threaten the very foundation of our civilization, Malith declared, his energy form pulsing with righteous anger. For over 1 million standard years, the non-interference directive has maintained peace and stability across the galaxy. Species develop at their own pace in their own time, without the corruption of outside influence. Ambassador Zephyr has violated this sacred trust. Defense attorney Crix rose to present his case, but his efforts seemed futile from the start. Every witness he called was either dismissed as unreliable or prevented from giving testimony by complex procedural rules. Evidence that might have supported Zephyr's actions was ruled inadmissible due to technicalities that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The other members of the tribunal remained silent throughout the proceedings. Arbiter Thessian, a crystalline being whose thoughts were usually transmitted through light patterns, showed no illumination at all. Arbiter Korvac, representing the Ursine Confederation, appeared to be sleeping. The remaining 4 arbiters showed similar disinterest, occasionally nodding when Vorak made procedural rulings but otherwise remaining passive observers to the legal theater unfolding before them. As the day wore on, it became clear that this wasn't a trial seeking truth or justice. It was a ritual, a ceremony designed to provide legal cover for what had already been decided in private chambers. The Federation Council wanted Zephyr silenced, her example erased so that no other ambassador would dare to show compassion for suffering beings. The viewing galleries began to empty as the day stretched toward its end. Even the most dedicated observers could see where this was heading. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense was being systematically dismantled, and the tribunal showed no interest in actual justice. But as the artificial sun began to set over Station Nexus, casting long shadows through the crystalline walls of the courtroom, something unexpected happened. A new figure entered the proceedings, walking through the main doors with quiet confidence. The being was bipedal, relatively small compared to most galactic species, with pale skin and strange patches of hair covering its head. It wore simple clothing and carried nothing but a small datapad. Most remarkably, it showed no fear or deference as it approached the tribunal. Chief Arbiter Vorak's compound eyes focused on the newcomer. "This court is in session. State your business or be removed." The being looked up at the massive insectoid without flinching. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm here to represent Earth in this proceeding." A murmur went through the remaining observers. Earth was barely known to most galactic civilizations, a small world on the far edge of explored space. What could such a primitive species possibly contribute to these proceedings? Vorak's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Earth has no standing in this court. "Remove this inhuman immediately." But Sarah Chen stood her ground, consulting her datapad with calm confidence. Actually, according to Galactic Treaty 2847C, any species that has achieved interstellar travel has the right to observe proceedings that might affect their sector of space. Earth achieved faster than light travel 6 months ago. The courtroom fell silent. Chief Arbiter Vorak's compound eyes shifted between different focal modes as he processed this unexpected development. The humans' claim about Earth achieving faster than light travel was news to most of the galactic community. Primitive worlds occasionally stumbled onto FTL technology, but they rarely made it far enough to reach major galactic institutions. Sarah Chen stood patiently, while Vorak's assistants, small scuttling creatures with multiple arms, quickly searched their databases. The courtroom remained silent. Thousands of beings watching this tiny human face down one of the most powerful judicial bodies in the galaxy. "The claim appears to be accurate," one of the assistants whispered to Vorak through a translation device. Earth registration was filed with the Commerce Guild 6 standard months ago. First contact protocols were apparently bypassed due to clerical errors. Vorak's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation that every being in the courtroom recognized. "Very well. Earth may observe these proceedings, but you have no authority to participate." Sarah nodded politely and took a seat in the observer section, but her eyes never left the proceedings. She pulled out a strange device that looked like a primitive recording instrument and began making notes. Unlike the other observers who had been growing restless and leaving, the human seemed intensely focused on every detail. The trial resumed with defense attorney Crix attempting to call his final witness, a colony administrator from the Kepler 442 system. Prosecutor Malith immediately objected. This witness was not approved by the court. "We submitted the witness list according to proper procedures," Crix protested, his tentacles writhing with frustration. Arbiter Vorak barely glanced at the paperwork. "Objection sustained. The witness is not permitted." Sarah Chen's head snapped up from her notes. She looked around the courtroom with obvious confusion, then raised her hand slightly. When no one acknowledged her, she stood up. "Excuse me," she said in a clear voice that carried across the massive space. Vorak's attention fixed on her with obvious irritation. "Observers do not speak during proceedings." "I apologize," Sarah replied, not sitting down. "I'm new to galactic legal procedures. On Earth, when evidence is excluded, the court explains why. Could you clarify the legal basis for excluding this witness?" A ripple of what might have been amusement went through the viewing galleries. Most galactic citizens had grown accustomed to the tribunal's arbitrary decisions. The idea of questioning their authority was almost unthinkable. The court is not required to explain its rulings to observers, Vorak snapped. Sarah consulted her datapad again. According to the Galactic Justice Charter, Section 15, Subsection 7, all rulings must be based on established legal precedent or clearly stated statutes. I'm just trying to understand which statute applies here. The silence that followed was deafening. Several of the other arbiters who had remained passive throughout the proceedings suddenly seemed more alert. Arbiter Thessian's crystalline form began to emit faint light patterns, indicating active thought processes. Prosecutor Maleth rose to address the interruption. The human observer clearly doesn't understand the complexities of galactic law. Perhaps it would be better if, actually, Sarah interrupted gently. I spent the last 3 months studying galactic legal codes in preparation for this trip. Earth's legal scholars are quite thorough. She held up her datapad, which was displaying text that none of the other beings in the courtroom had bothered to review in centuries. The Galactic Justice Charter is very clear about due process rights. Every defendant is entitled to present evidence and call witnesses in their defense, subject only to relevance and reliability standards. Vorak's compound eyes seemed to darken. The witness is unreliable. Based on what criteria? Sarah asked. The charter requires that reliability challenges be supported by evidence of bias, mental incapacity, or previous perjury. Which of these applies to Colony Administrator Vex? Defense Attorney Crix looked stunned. In 40 years of practice, he had never seen anyone challenge the tribunal's rulings with such direct reference to actual law. The galactic legal system had evolved into a complex web of traditions and precedents that most practitioners navigated through instinct and political connections rather than actual statute arbiter. Thessian's light patterns intensified. For the first time in the proceedings, she transmitted a thought message that appeared on screens throughout the courtroom. The observer raises valid procedural questions. Vorak's mandibles clicked furiously. The other arbiters were beginning to stir from their passive observation. This was not how galactic trials were supposed to proceed. The court will take a brief recess to review procedural matters, Vorak announced. As the arbiters withdrew to their chambers, the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Ambassador Zephyr looked at the human with new hope, while Prosecutor Maleth conferred urgently with his assistants. Sarah Chen remained in her seat, continuing to make notes. Defense Attorney Crix approached her cautiously. Human, Sarah. What are you doing? Crix asked, his tentacles coiling nervously. I'm observing a legal proceeding, Sarah replied simply. On Earth, we believe that justice requires following established law, not the whims of powerful individuals. But you don't understand, Crix whispered urgently. The tribunal's authority comes from tradition, from respect for their wisdom. Challenging them directly puts justice before politics, Sarah finished. Yes, I can see how that might be unusual here. During the recess, Sarah walked to the defendant's dock where Zephyr stood in her energy shackles. The guards, uncertain how to handle this unprecedented situation, allowed the conversation. Why are you helping me? Zephyr asked. Earth has no stake in this trial. Sarah looked at the blue-scaled ambassador with steady eyes. Because what happened to those colonies was wrong, and because someone needs to say so. But the non-interference directive is being used as an excuse to let people die when you have the power to save them, Sarah said. On Earth, we have a saying, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Zephyr felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt since the trial began. Hope. When the arbiters returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. Several more observers had arrived, apparently drawn by reports of the unusual proceedings. Arbiter Thessian's light patterns were more active than they had been in years. The court has reviewed the procedural objections, Vorak announced. The witness will be permitted to testify, but their testimony will be limited to factual observations only. It was a small victory, but Sarah Chen had achieved something that experienced galactic attorneys rarely managed. She had forced the tribunal to follow their own rules. Colony Administrator Vex, a tall humanoid with golden skin and large eyes, took the witness stand. His testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case. He described the plague that had swept through Kepler 442, the desperate requests for medical aid that went unanswered, and the arrival of Ambassador Zephyr's ships carrying the cure that saved millions of lives. Prosecutor Maleth objected repeatedly, but each objection had to be backed by legal precedent. Sarah Chen's challenge had changed the rules of the game. Ambassador Zephyr didn't just break the law, Vex testified. She saved our civilization. The Federation could have helped us months earlier, but they chose to let us suffer instead. As the testimony continued, Sarah noticed something else troubling about the proceedings. The prosecution's evidence was not just selectively edited. Some of it appeared to be fabricated entirely. Communication logs that supposedly showed Zephyr planning rebellious activities were dated incorrectly. Surveillance footage had been digitally altered to remove context. The trial wasn't just rigged, it was built on lies. Sarah began making careful notes about the inconsistencies, preparing for what she was beginning to realize might be Earth's first major intervention in galactic politics. Someone needed to speak for justice in this corrupted system, and perhaps humans were uniquely suited for the job. The second day of the trial brought larger crowds. Word had spread through Station Nexus about the human who had challenged the tribunal, and beings from dozens of species came to witness this unprecedented event. The viewing galleries were packed, with overflow crowds watching through public displays throughout the station. Sarah Chen arrived early, carrying a larger data device and what appeared to be additional recording equipment. She had spent the night analyzing the prosecution's evidence using techniques that were apparently unknown to galactic legal scholars. As the proceedings resumed, Prosecutor Maleth presented additional evidence against Ambassador Zephyr. Communication logs supposedly showed her coordinating with rebel groups, planning attacks against Federation installations. The logs were presented as absolute proof of her criminal intent. Sarah stood up again, her movement causing a ripple of anticipation through the courtroom. "I object to the admission of this evidence," she said clearly. The entire courtroom went silent. Observers didn't object to evidence. They barely spoke at all during proceedings. Chief Arbiter Vorak's compound eyes focused on her with undisguised hostility. "You have no standing to object to anything." "Actually, I believe I do," Sarah replied, consulting her datapad. Galactic Treaty 2847C grants observer species the right to challenge evidence that might affect their interests. These communication logs allegedly show planning for attacks on Federation shipping routes that pass through Earth's sector. It was a technicality, but it was legally sound. Sarah had studied galactic law more thoroughly in 3 months than most practitioners did in their entire careers. Arbiter, Thessian's light patterns intensified again. Her transmitted message appeared on screens. "Observer's objection has technical merit." Vorak's mandibles clicked rapidly. "State your objection." Sarah activated her data device, projecting a holographic display that showed the communication logs in detail. "These logs have been altered. The metadata doesn't match the timestamps, and the linguistic patterns are inconsistent with Ambassador Zephyr's established communication style." A murmur went through the courtroom. Beings leaned forward to examine Sarah's analysis. Furthermore, Sarah continued, the encryption signatures don't match Federation standard protocols from the dates these communications were allegedly sent. Someone created these logs after the fact. Prosecutor Maleth rose angrily. "This is absurd. The human has no expertise in galactic communication systems." Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Actually, Earth has become quite good at detecting falsified digital communications. We've had to deal with this problem for decades." She manipulated her display, showing detailed technical analysis that highlighted the inconsistencies. "On Earth, we call this digital forensics. Every electronic communication leaves traces that are almost impossible to falsify perfectly. These logs show clear signs of post-creation editing." Defense attorney Crix looked stunned. "You can prove the evidence is fabricated?" "Not just this evidence," Sarah said. She activated another display, showing analysis of the surveillance footage. This video was also altered. The timestamp jumps by 17 seconds at the 4:23 mark, and the lighting patterns are inconsistent with the reported time and location. The courtroom erupted in conversation. Beings throughout the galleries began examining the evidence displays with new interest. Several called up their own recording devices to document Sarah's analysis. Vorak slammed his ceremonial staff against the floor, creating a sound like thunder. "Order. This court will not be disrupted by wild accusations from a primitive species. Sarah turned to face the chief arbiter directly. These aren't wild accusations. They're measurable facts. On Earth, we have a principle. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The prosecution's claims are extraordinary, but their evidence is fraudulent. How dare you question the integrity of this court? Vorak's voice boomed across the chamber. I'm not questioning the court's integrity, Sarah replied calmly. I'm questioning the evidence that was presented to you, unless you were aware that it was fabricated. The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Either the tribunal had been deceived by false evidence, or they were complicit in presenting it. Arbiter Thessian's light patterns shifted to deep blue, indicating serious consideration. Her message appeared. Evidence analysis should be examined. For the first time, another arbiter spoke. Korvac of the Ursine Confederation, a massive bear-like being who had seemed asleep throughout most of the proceedings, raised his head. The human's technical analysis appears sound. I move for independent verification. Vorak's compound eyes darkened with fury, but he was being outmaneuvered by his own colleagues. The court will recess to examine this due analysis. During the recess, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters and observers. Beings she had never seen before approached her with recording devices and questions. Human Sarah called a tall, thin being with multiple arms. Are you claiming the entire prosecution case is fabricated? I'm claiming that significant portions of the evidence are falsified, Sarah replied. Whether that was done with the prosecution's knowledge is something the court will have to determine. A crystalline reporter with a voice like chimes asked, What gives Earth the right to interfere in galactic justice? Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. Justice isn't about rights, it's about responsibilities. When you see someone being wrongly accused, you have a responsibility to speak up. That's not interference, that's moral obligation. The crowd of reporters grew larger. Sarah's words were being transmitted across the galaxy, reaching worlds that had never heard of Earth before. Meanwhile, in the defendant's dock, Ambassador Zephyr watched the proceedings with growing amazement. Defense attorney Crix approached her with tentacles writhing in excitement. She's doing it, Crix whispered. The human is actually challenging them successfully. But why? Zephyr asked. What does Earth gain from this? Maybe that's what makes them different, Crix mused. Most species calculate the political cost of every action. Perhaps humans simply do what they believe is right. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The arbiters appeared to have engaged in serious discussion during the recess. Arbiter Thessian's light patterns were more active than they had been in years, and two other arbiters who had remained silent were now paying obvious attention. The court has completed its preliminary analysis, Vorak announced. The technical examination of the evidence will continue, but certain irregularities have been noted. Sarah stood again. Your Honor, if I may suggest, Earth has experts in digital forensics who could assist with the analysis. We've developed sophisticated techniques for detecting falsified evidence. That won't be necessary. Vorak snapped. Arbiter Thessian's message appeared. External expertise might provide valuable perspective. Another arbiter, zealous of the Avian Confederacy, spoke for the first time. The court benefits from thorough examination of evidence. If the human species has relevant expertise, we should consider it. Sarah could see the battle lines forming within the tribunal itself. Some arbiters were beginning to take seriously their responsibility to ensure fair proceedings, while others seemed committed to the predetermined outcome. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I believe the court should examine the broader context of Ambassador Zephyr's actions. The prosecution has presented her aid to the colonies as criminal activity, but they've ignored the humanitarian crisis that prompted her intervention. She activated another display, showing data about the plague on Kepler 442 and the crop failures on Tau Ceti. Ambassador Zephyr didn't act from criminal intent. She acted from moral necessity. The question isn't whether she broke the law, but whether the law itself is just. The courtroom went silent. Sarah had just challenged not only the evidence, but the fundamental principle underlying the prosecution. Prosecutor Maleth rose in fury. The non-interference directive has maintained galactic peace for 1,000,000 years. This human seeks to undermine the foundation of our civilization. Sarah turned to face him. A foundation built on allowing suffering when you have the power to prevent it isn't civilization. It's cowardice. The words echoed through the massive courtroom, reaching every being present. For the first time in living memory, someone had challenged not just a legal ruling, but the moral authority of the galactic system itself. And the challenge had come from a species most of them had never heard of until yesterday. Ambassador. Zephyr felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Pride in what the galaxy could become, if enough beings found the courage to stand up for what was right. The trial was no longer just about her fate. It had become a test of whether justice could triumph over political convenience in the galactic community. The third day of the trial brought unprecedented crowds to Station Nexus. Reports of the humans' challenge to the tribunal had spread across the galaxy overnight. Starships from dozens of worlds had arrived, carrying journalists, legal observers, and ordinary citizens who wanted to witness what many were calling the most important trial in galactic history. Sarah. Chen arrived to find the courtroom surrounded by protesters holding signs in various alien languages. Some supported the traditional order, demanding that the primitive human be silenced. Others called for justice and truth in galactic proceedings. The energy was electric and potentially dangerous. Inside the courtroom, the tribunal appeared divided. 3 arbiters sat on one side, led by Chief Arbiter Vorak, maintaining their rigid positions. 4 arbiters, including Thessian and Korvac, had moved to show their independence from the predetermined outcome. The physical separation was subtle but unmistakable to experienced observers. Before we continue, Vorak announced, the court wishes to address the disruptive influence of outside pressures on these proceedings. Sarah stood immediately. Your Honor, are you referring to the public interest in seeing justice done? I am referring to the inappropriate media coverage and political pressure being brought to bear on this tribunal. Sarah consulted her data pad. According to the Galactic Justice Charter, Article 12, all proceedings are public unless classified materials are involved. The Charter specifically encourages public oversight of judicial proceedings to ensure accountability. Arbiter Thessian's light patterns pulsed in what appeared to be approval. Her message appeared, public scrutiny strengthens judicial integrity. Vorak's compound eyes shifted angrily. The court does not require instruction on its own procedures. Of course not, Sarah replied politely. I'm simply noting that public interest in these proceedings demonstrates healthy civic engagement. On Earth, we believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant for corruption. The phrase was translated into dozens of languages simultaneously, creating a ripple of understanding through the viewing galleries. Many beings had never heard such a direct statement about official accountability. Prosecutor Maleth rose to resume his case, but his presentation lacked the confidence it had shown on the first day. The revelation that his evidence was falsified had shaken his position. He attempted to present additional witnesses, but each one's testimony seemed scripted and unconvincing. Sarah had spent the night analyzing not just the evidence, but the broader patterns of galactic justice. What she had discovered was disturbing. Your Honor, she said, standing once again, I request permission to present additional information relevant to these proceedings. Observers do not present information, Vorak snapped. Arbiter Korvac raised a massive paw. The human's previous analyses have proven valuable. I would hear what she has discovered. Sarah activated her holographic display, showing a complex web of data connections. I've analyzed similar cases tried before this tribunal over the past 50 standard years. The pattern is clear and troubling. The display showed trial after trial where evidence had been altered, witnesses silenced, and outcomes predetermined. Cases involving officials who had challenged Federation policy, researchers who had questioned established doctrines, and administrators who had shown compassion for suffering beings. This isn't an isolated case of prosecutorial misconduct, Sarah said. This is systematic suppression of dissent within the Federation. Ambassador Zephyr isn't being tried for breaking the law. She's being tried for having a conscience. The courtroom erupted. Beings throughout the galleries began talking excitedly, many pulling up their own records to verify Sarah's analysis. Several Federation officials in the courtroom looked uncomfortable, some beginning to leave through side exits. Prosecutor Maleth rose in fury. This is exactly the kind of conspiracy thinking that threatens galactic stability. The human is promoting dangerous ideas about our institutions. Sarah turned to face him directly. I'm promoting the idea that institutions should serve justice, not the other way around. That's not dangerous unless you're afraid of accountability. For the first time, defense attorney Cricks found his voice strengthened by Sarah's support. Your Honors, the evidence is clear. My client is being persecuted for acts of mercy. The prosecution's case rests on fabricated evidence and systematic suppression of truth. Arbiter Thessian's light patterns shifted to brilliant white, indicating maximum attention. Her message was longer than usual. These revelations require thorough investigation. Justice demands truth, not convenience. Another arbiter, Marin of the Telepathic Collective, spoke for the first time in the trial. I have been monitoring the emotional resonance of these proceedings. The prosecution exhibits patterns consistent with deception. The human observer shows only commitment to truth. Sarah felt a moment of concern about having her emotions read, but realized this might actually help her case. Unlike most galactic beings who had learned to hide their true feelings in political situations, humans wore their emotions openly. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I believe this tribunal should consider the broader implications of the non-interference directive as currently implemented. The directive was designed to prevent exploitation of primitive species, but it's being used to justify neglect of humanitarian crises. She displayed data about dozens of systems where Federation intervention could have prevented massive suffering, plagues that could have been cured, famines that could have been prevented, natural disasters where Federation technology could have saved millions of lives. The directive has become a shield for moral cowardice, Sarah said. Instead of protecting primitive species, it protects advanced species from having to make difficult ethical choices. Vorak's mandibles clicked frantically. The human speaks of matters far beyond her understanding. The directive has prevented countless wars. Has it?
Sarah asked.
Or has it simply allowed suffering to continue without your direct responsibility? She displayed another set of data showing conflicts that had erupted specifically because Federation species refused to provide aid to struggling civilizations. Desperate worlds that had turned to warfare because they saw no other option for survival. On Earth, we have learned that neutrality in the face of suffering is not moral, it's complicity. Ambassador Zephyr watched this exchange with growing amazement. The human was not just defending her actions, she was challenging the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization, and somehow she was winning. The viewing galleries had grown completely silent. Thousands of beings hung on every word, many hearing ideas that had never been expressed so clearly in galactic discourse. The concept that advanced civilizations had moral obligations to help others was radical in a society built on careful non-interference. Arbiter, zealous of the Avian Confederacy, spread his wings in a gesture of contemplation. The human raises profound questions about our responsibilities. Perhaps our interpretation of the directive has become too rigid. The directive exists for good reason, Prosecutor Maleth protested. Intervention leads to dependency, to cultural contamination, to the destruction of natural development. Sarah activated another display. This shows the development patterns of species that received aid during natural disasters versus those that didn't. Aid recipients actually developed stronger, more resilient civilizations. Help doesn't create dependency when it's given properly. The data was compelling. Species that had received assistance during crises had gone on to become valuable members of the galactic community, while those left to struggle alone often remained isolated and sometimes turned hostile. The problem isn't that helping other species is wrong, Sarah said. The problem is that you've confused helping with controlling. Ambassador Zephyr didn't try to control the colonies she helped. She simply provided the tools they needed to save themselves. For the first time since the trial began, Ambassador Zephyr was allowed to speak in her own defense. The human speaks truth, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. I didn't interfere with the colony's development. I gave them the chance to develop at all. The tide was turning. Sarah could see it in the arbiter's body language, in the reactions of the crowd, in the growing desperation of the prosecution's responses. The truth was winning, but she knew the most difficult part was yet to come. Challenging corruption was one thing. Changing an entire civilization's worldview was another. The fourth day of the trial brought a new crisis. As Sarah Chen entered the courtroom, she noticed immediately that something had changed. Several key Federation officials who had been present throughout the proceedings were absent. More concerning, defense attorney Cricks appeared nervous, his tentacles writhing constantly as he shuffled through his papers. Ms. Chen, Cricks whispered urgently as she took her seat. I've been warned to distance myself from Yuri's interventions. The Federation Council is not pleased with how this trial has developed. Sarah studied the elderly Voltan attorney carefully. Are you withdrawing from the case? I have to consider my career, my family's future, Crix admitted shamefully. The Federation has ways of making life difficult for those who oppose them too strongly. Before Sarah could respond, Chief Arbiter Vorak called the court to session. His demeanor was different today, more aggressive, as if he had received new instructions overnight. This court has been disrupted long enough by outside interference, Vorak announced. Today we will conclude testimony and move to final arguments. Sarah stood immediately. Your Honor, yesterday you agreed to investigate the systematic falsification of evidence. Has that investigation been completed? The court's internal investigations are not subject to external oversight, Vorak replied curtly. Arbiter Thessian's light patterns flashed red, indicating strong disagreement. Her message appeared. Investigation of evidence irregularities must be completed before proceedings continue. The investigation has been completed, Vorak said. Though several other arbiters looked surprised by this claim, no actionable irregularities were found. Sarah felt a chill run through her. The fix was in again, but this time at a higher level. Someone with significant power was working to end this trial quickly. Your Honor, she said, standing despite the danger, I have additional evidence that this tribunal needs to see. Observers may not present evidence. Then I invoke Article 47 of the Galactic Justice Charter, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom. Any being with knowledge of criminal conspiracy has the obligation to present such knowledge to proper authorities. The silence that followed was absolute. Article 47 was rarely invoked because it essentially required the court to treat the invoker as a witness, regardless of their normal standing. Vorak's compound eyes darkened with fury. You claim knowledge of criminal conspiracy? I do, Sarah replied steadily. And I can prove it. She activated her holographic display, but this time the data was different. Instead of technical analysis of evidence, she showed communication logs, financial records, and meeting schedules that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching to the highest levels of Federation government. 3 days ago, after I exposed the falsified evidence against Ambassador Zephyr, I received visits from Federation officials, Sarah said. They offered Earth preferential trade status, advanced technology, and guaranteed protection in exchange for my silence. A gasp went through the viewing galleries. Beings pulled out recording devices to capture this revelation. When I refused their offers, they made threats. They suggested that Earth's new membership in the galactic community could be revoked, that our shipping lanes could become dangerous, that our colonies might face natural disasters. Sarah displayed recordings of these conversations, her Earth technology having captured every word despite the visitors' assumptions that their discussions were private. But more importantly, Sarah continued, they revealed that this trial is part of a broader pattern. Ambassador Zephyr isn't being prosecuted for breaking the law. She's being eliminated because she represents a threat to a profitable system. The next display showed financial records that Sarah had somehow obtained. Defense contractors who profited from conflicts in the Outer Rim. Medical corporations that sold treatments for diseases they could have prevented. Resource extraction companies that exploited worlds kept deliberately primitive. The non-interference directive isn't being used to protect primitive species, Sarah said, her voice rising with controlled anger. It's being used to maintain markets for suffering. The courtroom erupted. Beings throughout the galleries began shouting, some in outrage at the revelations, others demanding that the lying human be silenced. Several Federation officials who were still present began pushing toward the exits. Prosecutor Maleth rose desperately. These are wild accusations without foundation. The human has no authority to make such claims. I have the authority of truth, Sarah replied. And I have evidence. She displayed more communications, these between Federation Council members and corporate interests. Plans to maintain manageable conflicts in border regions. Strategies to prevent premature development of resource-rich worlds. Detailed analyses of how humanitarian aid would impact corporate profits. Arbiter Korvac rose to his full impressive height. If these communications are authentic, they represent criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of government. They're fabricated, Vorak insisted. but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah smiled grimly. That's easily verified. Unlike the prosecution's evidence, these records include complete metadata, encryption signatures, and verifiable timestamps. I used the same forensic techniques that exposed their falsified evidence. Arbiter Thessian's light patterns were now cycling through complex arrangements that indicated intense analytical activity. Her message appeared. Communications show authentication markers consistent with Federation government systems. For the first time, another presence made itself known in the courtroom. A figure materialized in the center of the space, tall and imposing, wearing the robes of a Federation Council member. Counselor Drax, Vorak acknowledged nervously. Counselor Drax, an imposing reptilian being with scales that shifted color with his emotions, looked directly at Sarah. Human, you have overstepped your bounds severely. These proceedings will end now. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Counselor, are you here to ensure justice is served or to prevent it? I am here to maintain order and stability, Drax replied coldly. Stability built on corruption and suffering isn't order, Sarah said. It's oppression with good public relations. The confrontation between the human and the powerful counselor held the entire courtroom transfixed. Here was a being who could order the destruction of star systems facing down someone who had appeared from nowhere just days before. You do not understand the complexities of galactic governance, Drax said. Your primitive species sees only simple moral choices where sophisticated beings recognize necessary compromises. Sarah's response was quiet, but carried to every corner of the massive space. If sophistication means the ability to rationalize evil, then I prefer to remain primitive. Ambassador Zephyr watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. The human was risking everything, her planet's future, her own life, her species' place in the galaxy, to defend principles that most galactic beings had forgotten existed. Furthermore, Sarah continued, addressing not just Drax but the entire courtroom, humanity rejects the premise that complexity requires moral compromise. We've faced difficult choices throughout our history, and we've learned that doing the right thing is often harder than doing the expedient thing, but it's never impossible. She gestured to the displays still showing evidence of systematic corruption. This isn't complexity. This is a choice between profit and principle, between convenience and conscience, and when faced with that choice, any being who chooses profit over lives has already lost their claim to sophistication. Counselor Drax's scales shifted to deep red, indicating dangerous anger. You threaten the stability of the entire galaxy with your naive idealism. I threaten a corrupt system, Sarah corrected. The galaxy will be fine. It might even be better. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Thousands of beings held their breath, waiting to see whether truth or power would prevail in this unprecedented confrontation. Then, Arbiter Thessian did something that hadn't happened in living memory. She rose from her seat, her crystalline form blazing with light patterns that conveyed absolute determination. Her message appeared not just on courtroom screens, but was broadcast across the galaxy. This tribunal recognizes the evidence of systematic corruption. These proceedings will continue until truth is established and justice is served. The revolution had begun. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as Arbiter Thessian's declaration spread across 1,000 worlds. Within hours, peaceful demonstrations began on dozens of Federation worlds. Beings who had accepted corruption as an inevitable part of governance suddenly saw an alternative in the small, human who had dared to speak truth to power. But the immediate response within the courtroom was chaos. Counselor, Drax's scales had shifted to black, indicating lethal fury. Arbiter Thessian, you are exceeding your authority. This tribunal serves at the pleasure of the Federation Council. This tribunal serves justice, Thessian replied through her light patterns, her message appearing simultaneously across galactic communication networks. Article 1 of the Galactic Justice Charter establishes judicial independence from political interference. Sarah Chen watched the confrontation between these powerful beings with growing amazement. The human intervention had triggered something much larger than she had anticipated. She was witnessing the birth of a galactic constitutional crisis. Arbiter Thessian, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension. May I present additional evidence to support the tribunal's investigation? Before Thessian could respond, Counselor Drax turned his attention back to Sarah. Human, you will cease this disruption immediately, or Earth will face consequences beyond your imagination. The threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Sarah felt the weight of her entire species' future resting on her next words. "Counselor," she said with calm dignity, "are you threatening genocide against Earth because we've exposed corruption in your government?" The word genocide was translated into 100 languages simultaneously, creating a shockwave through the viewing galleries. Many beings had never heard such an accusation made so directly against Federation leadership. "I am promising consequences for interference in galactic governance," Drax replied, but his phrasing sounded weak after Sarah's stark characterization. Sarah activated her recording device. "Let the record show that a Federation Council member has threatened Earth with destruction because we've provided evidence of criminal conspiracy." The recording began broadcasting immediately, through the galactic news networks. Within minutes, beings across the galaxy were hearing a Federation councilor threaten a peaceful species for exposing the truth. Ambassador Zephyr found her voice for the first time in days. "Counselor Drax, these threats prove everything the human has said. You're not here to ensure justice. You're here to protect criminals." "Silence," Drax roared. "You are a convicted criminal." "Actually," Sarah interjected, "she hasn't been convicted of anything yet. And based on the evidence we've presented, she may be the only law-abiding official in this entire system." More arbiters were beginning to speak up. Arbiter Korvac rose to his impressive height. "Counselor, your presence here violates the separation of judicial and executive authority. I request that you withdraw immediately. I will not be lectured by subordinates." Drax snarled. "We are not subordinates," Arbiter Zealous said, spreading his wings in a gesture of defiance. "We are independent arbiters of justice, and we demand that you respect that independence." Sarah realized that something unprecedented was happening. The Tribunal of Seven, which had operated as a rubber stamp for Federation policy for centuries, was asserting its constitutional authority for the first time in living memory. "Furthermore," Sarah said, seizing the moment, "I have additional evidence that this tribunal should see." She activated her largest holographic display yet, showing a complex web of connections between Federation officials, corporate interests, and suppressed humanitarian crises across the galaxy. "The conspiracy goes beyond simple corruption," Sarah explained. "There's a systematic effort to maintain artificial scarcity and suffering to preserve existing power structures. The non-interference directive isn't just being misused, it was designed from the beginning to serve these interests." The display showed the original drafting of the directive, including communications between its authors and corporate representatives. The language had been carefully crafted to prevent help while appearing to protect primitive species. "My God," breathed Defense Attorney Crix, his tentacles writhing in shock. "The entire legal framework is corrupted." "Not corrupted," Sarah corrected. "Designed." This wasn't a gradual decay of noble intentions. This was a deliberate creation of a system that would maximize suffering while minimizing responsibility. The viewing galleries had become completely silent. Thousands of beings absorbed the implications of Sarah's revelations. Many were learning for the first time that the foundation of their civilization was built on deliberate cruelty. Counselor Drax made a fatal mistake. Faced with evidence he couldn't refute and accusations he couldn't deny, he resorted to raw power. "Enough," he roared. "Security forces arrest the human for sedition against galactic order." Armed guards began moving toward Sarah, but they stopped when Arbiter Thessian blazed with light patterns so intense they were visible, even in the bright courtroom illumination. "Any being who interferes with these judicial proceedings will face charges of contempt and judicial obstruction," Thessian declared. "This tribunal is under the protection of galactic law." The guards hesitated, caught between conflicting authorities. In that moment of uncertainty, something remarkable happened. Beings throughout the viewing galleries began to stand. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They weren't protesting or chanting. They were simply standing in silent support of the principles Sarah had articulated. The movement spread beyond the courtroom. Reports came in of beings across the galaxy standing in solidarity, refusing to accept a system built on suffering. Peaceful demonstrations grew on world after world, all sparked by one human's refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Sarah looked around the courtroom with wonder. "Do you see?" she asked. addressing not just the tribunal but the entire galaxy watching through broadcast networks. This is what happens when you trust beings to choose right over wrong. Most people, most beings want to do good. They just need someone to show them it's possible. Counselor Drax realized his authority was crumbling. The Federation's power had always rested on the assumption that corruption was inevitable, that ordinary beings couldn't be trusted with moral choices. Sarah had shattered that assumption simply by demonstrating an alternative. "You're destroying everything we've built," Drax accused desperately. "We're destroying everything that was built on lies," Sarah replied. "What comes next will be built on truth." Arbiter Thessian's light patterns shifted to gold, indicating decision and resolution. This tribunal finds that the evidence presented demonstrates systematic criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of Federation government. We order the immediate suspension of all officials implicated in these activities pending full investigation. "You have no authority," Drax began. "We have the authority of law and the support of the governed," Arbiter Korvac interrupted, "both of which you have forfeited." For the first time since entering the courtroom, Counselor Drax looked uncertain. The power structure he had relied on for his entire career was collapsing around him. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying to every being in the courtroom and beyond. "The choice is simple now. You can continue to support a system built on suffering, or you can help build something better. But you can't claim ignorance anymore. Everyone knows the truth." As if responding to her words, more reports came in from across the galaxy. Federation officials on dozens of worlds were resigning, rather than continue participating in the corrupt system. Military commanders were refusing orders that violated basic ethical principles. Ordinary citizens were demanding accountability from their governments. The revolution that had begun with one human's moral courage was spreading across the stars. Ambassador Zephyr watched these events with tears streaming down her scaled cheeks. The trial that was supposed to destroy her had instead triggered the greatest moral awakening in galactic history, and it had all started because one small human had refused to stay silent in the face of injustice.